All right, perfect. Thanks so much, everybody. And thanks for joining me for this session, making your messages stick, thinking differently about communication online. So as Joanne said, my name is Heather Mannix. I am the Assistant Director of Policy Engagement at Compass. I've been with Compass for about 6 years, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. Compass is a boundary organization, which means that we work at the interface of science and policy, and we're a nonprofit. We champion, connect, and support diverse science leaders to improve the well-being of people and nature. So we really work with the scientific community to help them share their messages, share their work in an effective and interesting way to try to get that out there into especially the public policy dialogues. And that's my background. As Joanne said, I have spent a long time working in the policy world, kind of straddling the worlds of science and policy together, and thinking about how scientists can reach decision makers. And so our work, it takes many forms, from training folks at short workshops. We do longer, deeper dive workshops and communications trainings that span multiple days, to the other half of our work, which is actually bringing together scientists with journalists or scientists with policymakers, putting together events that bring everyone together to talk about important issues, scientific issues. And so Compass was founded at on the premise that science needs to have a seat at the decision-making table, because science and scientists themselves have the potential to transform critical dialogues. As articulated here by one of our co-founders, Dr. Jane Lutchenko, a key part of science playing an instrumental role in decision-making is effective communication, and that's what we do. We help scientists become effective communicators, and we forge those connections between scientists and other audiences. And this is all in the name of policy, resource management, the broader public discourse being better informed by science. So you've noticed our work at Compass focuses heavily kind of on the environment. So a lot of my examples really pull from that work, but I think you'll find that there's some relevance and resonance in your own work as well from all of my examples. And so at Compass, we have a saying, begin with the end in mind. So think about what you ultimately want to accomplish, who you want to communicate with, and why. And so what our end today is, we're going to start by thinking about what is the science of science communication? What is the foundation of good communication? There's a really growing body of literature around this that lays the groundwork for successful engagement, and we'll dive into that a little bit. Next, we're going to think about how to develop an effective message from your work, how you can take your information and put it into the eyes of your audience, thinking about who your audience is and why that matters and what they want to learn from you. And I'm going to introduce one of the tools that we have at Compass that you can use, download for free off of our website, and hopefully find useful. And then finally, we're going to talk about social media specifically as a channel to share those messages that you develop. So it's a bit of a three-step process here today. And so I'll just take a minute to address the elephant in the room that is COVID-19. Rather than convening together, engaging and networking with friends and colleagues, you're likely watching this talk from home. You're figuring out ways to continue engaging with the wider world while we all experience kind of various levels of being home and being in social lockdown, and it's really hard. So you might be thinking about when anything other than COVID or the election might get some airtime on the news. It seems like everything else has just kind of taken a back seat. And so, we recently held a workshop with scientists focused on conservation and climate adaptation. And in a follow-up conversation with them, we posed some of these questions for discussion, like how should we be communicating about climate change in the time of COVID, when? And, as a group, we really concluded that we can't really afford to not be communicating our work during this time, right? We can't just stop, but we need to do it with sort of this humility and nuance and in a COVID-sensitive way. So I thought I'd just put that out there for any of you who might be thinking about this too. Okay, so we'll start with the science of science communications kind of foundation. And to kick us off, I'm going to actually start with a bit of a fairy tale. So once upon a time, there was a public beset by the ills of our modern era. They were lost, confused, and frustrated. And along came a researcher who dropped science and facts, and they all lived happily ever after. And so, I'd like to ask all of you, how many of you experience this? You drop a few facts, you share some of your very well-researched information with a group, and kind of the problems are solved, and we go from there. And so I think what I get when I ask this question to my researchers that I work with is that even though logically we think that this is how it should work, that we can just put our information out there and people will take it up and solve problems with it, it's actually a fantasy. And this is kind of more what we see. You say, science, facts, information. They say, And so with some concern, you say, science, with a little more pizzazz. They say, And then with growing frustration, you say, science, information, this is important, please pay attention, only to discover that maybe some of this frustration and resentment is now directed at you. And so where does this leave us? And so this reaction that we tend to get as scientists, and is pretty familiar to us, is really well encapsulated in this quote by Kevin Finneran, who's the editor-in-chief at Issues of Science and Technology. And he says, sometimes we're like tourists. We think if we just speak loudly enough, people will understand. And we call that shouting information into the void. And in science communication, in this field, it's called the deficit model. And it's proven really ineffective by cognitive researchers. Because your audiences, the people who you're trying to reach, have a lifetime of experiences that shape how they understand the world around them. And we need to take that into consideration as we communicate and make sure our conversations reflect that. We want people to engage with what we're sharing, to be interested in and excited about it, and think about how to apply it, not just listen to it. And we find communication is most effective when it's a conversation, not a lecture. So let's talk a little bit about how to do this. How do we get past this idea of sort of dumping our information on someone and instead really engage them? And so interestingly, one of the most important ways that we can engage people and in our work is by listening to them. And so regardless of how familiar you are or think you are with your audience, listening to them and engaging in a two-way conversation is an important way to show them that you want to understand them and where they're coming from. You're not here to lecture or talk down to them. You're here to work towards a common purpose. Humans were wired really to interact in agree or disagree mode. So when you hear something, when you probably are listening to me speak right now, you're thinking, do I agree or do I disagree with this? And we're also communicating across differences of perspective, values, and experiences, which makes this a really easy crutch to sort of fall back on. But real listening is a willingness to let the other person change you and to sort of open up and step back from that agree and disagree mode to really hear what they're saying and think about, am I willing to have my mind sort of changed on this? So next, we really need to understand the values that people hold and when we're communicating with them. At their core, values are what we really hold important and dear in life. And they vary from person to person and influence the world and how we behave in it. And there's a lot of social science research about the effectiveness of recognizing the values that your audience holds, finding that common ground and then speaking to that common ground. Sometimes, to me, this might feel a little weird, like, I'm just telling them what they want to hear. And certainly there are some who would approach it like that, but it doesn't need to be like that. You can do this in an authentic way. And especially the type of research and work that you all do, which is about people ultimately, you can find the things that you have in common and the things that you hope for and the outcomes that you're looking for. And so kind of continuing along with this theme, in addition to value, trust matters too. So the way that people process information is really strongly tied to their values, as we said, and their cultural identities and that context that they bring into the conversation. So when we think about that, there's some research by Dr. Susan Fiske at Princeton University, and she found that when she looked at the different occupations and sort of the trust that they in gender, and in this work, trustworthiness is a combination of perceived warmth and competence, right? And so warmth in this work is not necessarily warmth like friendliness, but it's how we understand people's motives. Do we think their motives are good or not good? And so in her work, she found that scientists are seen very competent, but they're also seen as cold when they communicate. So we lack, as scientists, we lack that warmth when we're trying to reach out to people. And so trust in the messenger, trust in who we are is super important. And people really want to know that the person talking to them is a human being with their own values and point of view, and that the message that they share reflects some of those values. Because the way that I've laid this out, it sounds a lot like belonging, right? Belonging is a universal human desire to be part of something larger than ourselves and to have a shared purpose. And this doesn't have to come at a cost of closing yourself off to those who are different to you, like a retreat to sameness. And so ultimately what we find, what the science of science communication is finding, is that positive beliefs about scientists and science are more likely to stem from high quality interactions with likable and engaging scientists who are willing to listen. And we can say this, I think, about a lot of things, right? It's not just science and scientists, but just people, people who are willing to be likable and engaging and listen. And so I think this, if I was to kind of boil all of this down into a cartoon, this is what I would say. And so when you're thinking about your audience, you want to think about where is that overlap? Where is that bubble of what you care about and what I care about, and how can I sort of direct our conversation and what I'm talking about to find those places of mutual interest. And so the key really is to think about who your audience is, right? I've talked a lot about audience. I've said it probably 15 times already. So the more specific you identify, the easier it is to tailor that message to your audience. And so some questions that you can ask yourself when you're saying, who is my audience? Who are these people that I want to work with? So these are some questions that you can ask, you know, who benefits from your work? Who cares about it? Who needs to hear about it? Who funds your work? To whom are you ultimately accountable? These are all questions to get you thinking about who are the folks that you want to communicate with and target with your messages. And so I want to mention too, one of the audiences that I hear a lot when someone says, well, I want to reach everyone. I really want to talk to the general public. I think my research is important for everybody. And so I understand that. You feel like your research has a lot of meaning for many different folks kind of across the spectrum. But what I will say is that that is the hardest kind of audience to develop a message for. And so you really want to try to be more specific. The more specific you can be when you're developing a message for an audience, the easier it's going to be and the more effective the message is. And so you can have multiple messages for different audiences. But in general, you want to avoid trying to create a message for everyone. Okay, and so when we're kind of thinking about this, when we're thinking about our audience, this is, I think, probably the most important two words that I'll say to you today. So what? Every person wants to know why this matters to them. Why does your work matter to them? And you need to show that to your audience when you talk to them. It starts to get at those values. Why should they care about what you have to say? And so we can think of this as kind of passing your message through what we call a so what prism, right? So you have a message that you want to share. You have work, information, and so you can pass it through this prism of why should someone care about this? And so some examples of this, policymakers. So why should they care about what your work? The questions you can ask. They'll be asking you, when they're listening to you talk about your work or reading something that you put together, they're asking, does this support or refute my agenda? Do my constituents care about this? Physicians and counselors might be another audience that you all have. And so, what are they thinking about when they're reading your work or coming across it? They're thinking, will this help me treat my patients, right? Fellow scientists, your colleagues, what are they thinking about when you're talking about your work? What are you thinking about when you hear someone talk about their work? How does this affect my work? What are the gaps? Is this person a competitor, maybe a collaborator? The media, the media is an audience that you're interested in, they'll be thinking about, is this news? Will it sell? Communities, oftentimes people work with communities, and they're thinking, is there risk to my community? Is there benefits? Does this work talk about any of that? Health organizations as an audience, how does this help serve our membership? And finally, funders. Is this a fit potentially for our strategies? So this isn't an exhaustive list of the questions, but it starts to help you get into the minds and think about how to parse out some of this. Your message itself doesn't change the information you want to share, but it's sort of how you connect with the people and what aspects of your message that you want to share. Okay, so now I'm going to transition into thinking about that message. How do you develop a really good message and share our tool that we use called the message box? And you can see it here. It's very simple. It's available to download on our website for free. So I encourage you all to kind of check that out if this is something that you think could be helpful to your work. So the message box takes that mountain of information that you might have in your head. As researchers, I think we spend a lot of time focused on our specific topic. We know a lot about it, and it gets really hard when we're asked a question to just to distill it down. And so, I can tell a personal story from this. When I was getting my master's degree, I was graduating, and my family came to visit, and we all went out to lunch, and it was really nice. And we're sitting around the table, and I had just kind of handed in my master's thesis, and my mom says, "So tell us what you've been working on." And I said, "Oh, great, let me tell you all about it." And so I probably went on for 5 to 10 minutes about international environmental organizations and a lot of the nuance behind, why some things are carried and why some science makes it into them and why not. And, finally I took a step back and took a breath, and my mom looks at me and she goes, "Well, that sounds just great." And so, everybody went on to kind of order their lunch, and that was that. And so this was my family, and so for better or worse, I have another chance at kind of giving them that information. But if you're talking with a policymaker, if you're meeting with, a physician or reaching out to someone who only has a few minutes of their time, you might not get that second chance. And so you really want to think about kind of how do I develop a message that opens the door and starts a conversation and gets people interested in what I have to say. And hopefully this tool can help you kind of think about how to do that. And so you may have seen this kind of image and diagram before, but it bears repeating. And so as scientists and researchers, we really share our work by building on a foundation of information, the supporting tools and methodology before sharing the final result. That's how we're trained to share this information. That's how the rest of the scientific community judges its effectiveness, its how good it is. But most people outside of that community, they don't really care that much about the background, right? They want to know what the result is. They want to put that right up front. And so if you want to hold attention and begin a productive dialogue, you really need to lead with what you know, why it matters to them, and then you can add sort of some of that supporting information. And so Natasha Loder is a journalist who we work with The Economist, and she says, very often when scientists complain about the way their stories were covered, it's because they've not delivered any message and left the journalists to think one up for themselves. I think this is really interesting. Certainly there are bad journalists out there that will sensationalize your work, take it, and not do you justice. I don't want to downplay that aspect of it, but I think what she's getting at is that if you do this work up front, if you create a good message, take that time to really think about what you want to share and who you're trying to reach with that message, it's a lot more likely that you're going to see that reflected in in what comes out of it. And so, not letting people kind of think up the message for themselves, but you're the one kind of controlling that. So message, what is a message? Messages are really, they're three main things. They're take-home ideas for your audience. And so, I've heard that cognitive research, it tells us that we can really only hold 3 to 5 pieces of information in our head at one time. And so when you're thinking about what you want to say and what you want to communicate, you really need to think carefully and distill down and figure out what are those top 3 to 5 pieces of information that you want your audience to walk away with. You want them to be simple, but not simplistic. So what do I mean by that? It means, we're not dumbing things down. We want them to be understandable, but I hate that phrase, dumbing down, because your audience isn't dumb necessarily. They just don't have as much background in the topic as you do. And finally, you want to make it memorable. How can it stick? And we're going to go through some techniques to really think about how you can make messages stick. So like I said, as scientists, this is how we're trained, right? To communicate, this is how our papers are laid out. Oftentimes, this is how posters at scientific conferences are laid out too. And so what this message box does is it takes it through the filter of your audience to think about it in a little bit of a different way. And so I'm going to walk you through this tool really quickly, just so you have an idea of how it works, and I'll show you an example, and then we'll go on to talk about a little bit more about how you can make those messages sticky, like I said. So the first thing you want to do, as always, is identify your audience when you're coming up with a message. Who is it that you want to talk to? Think about those questions that I posited earlier to you. And then you want to go and think about what is the big picture? What is the issue that you're trying to convey? If you can think about it as typing it in, if you're going to type it into Google, what are like a few key words that you would type into Google to get what this issue is, what it is you want to talk about? And then problems. So what is this, if you're talking about a paper, this can be your research question. It's basically your slice of this issue. What is the problem that you're trying to solve? And then what to do about that problem, or what are you doing about that problem? So how do we solve this problem? Benefits. How will it benefit your audience if we solve the problem? And why should they care? So there's a lot of ways that you can use this tool. You can use it, before you go into a meeting, briefing up to leadership. If you're writing a report, creating a one-pager, drafting remarks, it's kind of, we call it a multi-tool. So I'll show you an example of how this works. So this is Dr. Joe Hoyt. He works at Virginia Tech. He's research faculty in the biological sciences. And so Joe and I had planned to go to Capitol Hill because he worked on white nose syndrome in bats. And so when we were thinking about who could he speak with about his research and why would they care about it, we came across this representative, Dan Newhouse, who is a Republican in Washington State. And the reason that we thought that he might care about this is because he lives in a really agricultural district. And so Joe's research is really on conservation, and that is not actually an interest of Representative Newhouse. It's not a big issue for him, but because he does have an agricultural district and bats are actually very important in agriculture, we were able to sort of pivot that message to talk about something that he cares about. So, for example, Washington State in particular has seen unprecedented outbreaks of white nose syndrome in bats this summer. That's new, that's interesting, and that matters to him because he's from Washington State. And so what? Why does this matter to him? Bats are crucial for controlling populations of insects that can disrupt farming by damaging wheat and other crops. The benefits, if he listens or does something about this white nose syndrome, the healthy bat populations will reduce pests and increase agricultural efficiency. And the solutions, what can we do about this? So currently there wasn't an agency responsible for wildlife diseases, so he was suggesting setting up kind of a body to respond to these diseases. So this is the way that he took research and said, you know, there's a problem with bats, and this is why you should care about it, and this is what you can do about it. Okay, so if you look on our website, there's a lot more examples of this that you can look at too, from all different fields. So if you find that to be an interesting tool to kind of help you think about how to develop a great message, take a look at that. Okay, so when we think about these messages, once you sort of have those basics in mind, kind of what you want to say and who you want to say it to, there's a few kind of tips and tricks to keep in mind that I'm going to talk about. The first is jargon. So I think if you've ever talked about communicating your work, you've probably heard that you need to avoid jargon, right? It doesn't help your cause. And in fact, there's research that says that people, when they're exposed to sort of these jargon-filled explanations of science, instead of feeling like, oh, I'm speaking with an expert or they really know what they're talking about, the study showed that people, like with all the jargon, reading all the jargon led them to actually not believe the science. When you have a difficult time sort of processing this jargon, you start to kind of counter-argue. You don't like what you're reading. But when it's easier to read, you're actually more persuaded and you're more likely to support sort of the technology or the work that you read about. So I think that's kind of an interesting way to think about it. And then there's this other kind of jargon. So, you know, I think jargon is words that we don't understand, words that are not familiar in our everyday language. But then there's this kind of sneaky jargon that can come in that I want you to be aware of. And so this is when jargon has a different meaning to the public than it might have to scientists. So this is a paper that was published in 2011 around climate change. And so you can hear some of these words that might be a little bit of a, I guess you could say red herring. So theory, for example, we understand it as a scientific understanding, but the public kind of hears that as a hunch, for example. Positive feedback is one that can trip folks up. Scientists know this as it's a self-reinforcing cycle, but when you hear the word positive feedback, I think a lot of people think that it's a good response. So you can think about what are these words that don't, you know, we might understand, but have a different meaning for, depending on our background. Okay, and so metaphors are very powerful. And so using these to kind of explain what you're talking about can be really helpful. It's worth taking the time to really think about and even to brainstorm with others about metaphors that work for your work, because they are so powerful at getting people to understand what you're talking about. And so this is an example from Joe Palca at NPR talking about viruses, very relevant kind of in the current COVID-19 landscape. So he says, a vaccine says to a person's immune system, this is what this virus looks like, but I'm not actually showing you the virus. I'm showing you something that looks like the virus. It's like showing someone a picture and saying, if this person shows up at your door, don't let them in. And vaccine manufacturers have to do the equivalent of saying, do we go door to door showing people the picture, put them on highway billboards, can you use them in pop-up ads on a computer? And so the designers have a lot of choices about which picture to use and how best to present it to the system. So this is a really nice way of understanding sort of how vaccines work and why they can be hard to manufacture. Okay, next. We want to think about using local examples. So this is particularly effective because people like to, as we said, you know, they want to see themselves sort of in their research. They want to understand how what you're saying really connects to them and their lives. And so this is an example from Tracy Hall at the University of Wisconsin. And she said, you know, in the Midwest, it's 7 degrees warmer in the winter since 1974. And that's the difference between wearing and not wearing long underwear. So that's something that people who live in Wisconsin would probably really appreciate. And it's nice because it kind of gets that one piece of information, that one fact that can kind of stick in your mind too. Okay. Storytelling is another way to help your information stick with folks. And in fact, stories are remembered up to 22 times alone, 22 times more than facts alone. We are hardwired to appreciate stories, to remember them. And so, you know, the studies show that if you share a story, people are often more likely to be persuaded. And especially when you compare that with just kind of text, which is, you know, basic facts and figures and explanations. Narrative text was read faster and recalled better, regardless of the topic familiarity or the interest in the content itself. And so what we find is that when facts and figures are woven into a story, it can pull at the audience both intellectually and emotionally. And so these can be long stories or they can be short stories. This isn't something that you have to, you know, that has to be a very drawn out thing. Anecdotes help too. But incorporating some of that really helps your information kind of stick with people. And storytelling is something that's becoming very, very popular in science communication. And so there's a lot of workshops. I run a 2-day workshop actually on storytelling, helping people kind of come up with it, because it's hard. It's not easy, especially if your natural kind of tendency is around technical writing, for example. Storytelling might not come naturally to it, but it's something you can get better at, and that if you practice and think about, you can really, it can be a really effective kind of tool in your toolbox when you're communicating. Finally, be human. So this connects back to what I was talking about with the values. If we're trying to share information with people in the hope that they'll act or do something differently, people fail to act not because they do not have enough information, but because they don't care or they don't know what to do. So by finding ways to connect with folks, we can really make our information more usable, which I think is ultimately the reason that we kind of do the work that we do, right? We don't just want it to sit on the shelf. We want people to do something with it. Okay, so we've talked about the basics, the foundations of science communication. We've talked about what a message is and, you know, how to create a good message. And so now I want to talk about social media as a channel, as an outlet, as a place for you to share that work and think about, you know, how we can do this. So, and that is the theme of this year's conference. So I'm excited to get a chance to kind of talk to you all about this. And so when we talk about social media, we're really talking about internet-based applications that allow you to create and exchange content with other people. And so some examples, you know, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, seems like there's, you know, a new one every week, TikTok. If you're online and connecting with other people, odds are that it's considered social networking. And social media has fundamentally changed the way that people communicate. And so even if you're not an active user, it's pretty important to understand that there is a larger conversation happening out there in social media and that it's relevant to you and your work. And so it often seems like social media should be pretty simple or easy or intuitive, but in reality, it's not always that way. And we're often left feeling kind of like this, like it's like overwhelming, we're confused, and maybe there's this perception that you have to do all of the social media or you're not doing it right and somehow you'll fail. But I think what the bigger question is when we're thinking about how can we engage in this channel and do it effectively, we really want to think about why. Why are we using social media? And you really want to think about how you can get a return on investment so that it's not just one more thing to check off your list, but that it's something that really amplifies your work. And so let's explore how social media can be used to amplify your work and to help you build relationships too. As we find ourselves in this increasingly remote virtual world, how can we use social media to take the place of some of that networking that we used to do in person, those handshakes, those conversations over drinks late at night? Maybe can social media take the place of some of that? And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the concerns that we often hear from scientists about using social media, and then I'll wrap up this talk by talking about, you know, some specific examples of how scientists have effectively used social media to amplify their work and put themselves out there. So the number one thing I think we hear from scientists about this is I simply don't have time. I mean, I get that there are a lot of pressures growing every day on researchers and what they're really expected to do in their role and in their work. But, you know, what you're saying is that I really don't have time for this. I simply don't have time for this. And so, again, thinking about that return on the investment, how can we say that doing this is worthwhile because it will give me the return and the benefits that I want? And so this research from the Pew Research Center, it shows that, you know, 90% of people in the US use the internet, and a huge 72% use social media in some format. And so social media is a place where people are spending their time, right? This is a place where eyeballs are, where people are reading and finding things out. And so by choosing to engage in social media, you're really making a strategic choice to be where your audience is. This isn't like a fringe thing. It's a valid communication platform and outlet. You know, you don't have to be there if your audience isn't there, if that's not who you're trying to reach when you've done the work to figure that out. But you also shouldn't be sort of afraid of it or think that it's like a distraction. And it can feel really paralyzing when you look at all the different platforms. So you have to put a little bit of work in to think about what platform it is that you want to use, learn it, and find your people on it, find the people who you want to reach. Sometimes we hear concerns about kind of platforms dying, you know, that, oh, I've invested all of this kind of effort into this and now nobody's there, nobody's using it. And that can happen, but, you know, I think what we see is that these really big platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, they're not going anywhere. You know, they have evolved and they'll keep evolving, and they all have like very large audiences associated with them. But you do want to think about what is unique and special about kind of each of these places and how can they sort of help. So Facebook is pretty relationship driven, for example. Twitter is very content driven for, you know, I think substantive scientific discussion. Instagram is very visually driven, for example. So when you think about kind of what am I trying to accomplish, you want to keep that in mind. And so this is all kind of part of your research and when you think about that. So for example, if you're on the ground in the community, we just heard a talk about kind of how those Facebook groups can be used for research. Facebook is great for that if you want to be on the ground. Policymakers, if that's an audience that you're interested in reaching, they tend to spend more time on Twitter, for example. And so I'm going to, because I don't really have time to go into every platform that's out there, I'm going to talk about Twitter for the most part, but a lot of it is really translatable sort of across them. And so I'm choosing Twitter because it's this established platform where you can really connect broadly to a lot of different audiences, scientific and otherwise. It also forces you to be very concise and distill your message, get it down to exactly what you want to say. And with roughly about 100 million daily users, it's one of the largest and most widely read platforms. It's not necessarily the most used, but the people who use it, they really use it. They go there, 71% of Twitter users that's where they get their news, is on that site. And so we can see in this work in Nature, this is a few years old, it's about 6 years old. So I'm sure it's probably changed by then, the social media world changes so quickly, but the point that I want to make with this is that not all scholars use social media in the same way. For example, discovering peers is different than commenting on research. So you kind of have to think about why people are there and what they're doing on the platform. It can be very, very different depending on who's using it. And I think COVID has really kind of changed how we use social media too. There's sort of like light and dark sides to it. There's this idea of doom scrolling, you know, where you're kind of like scrolling through them with other people in this pit of despair. But there also have been a rise, for example, in accounts from disease experts where people are going to social media to get this access to experts. And so figuring out kind of that role and goal, why people are there, why you're there, if you want to be efficient with your time and energy. because time is our most precious resource. So, okay, another fear that people have about social media is trolling and backlash. We hear about this a lot. And I think what I will say about this is that for the most part, I think the fear of this happening is more than the reality of it. For the most part, it doesn't, most people do not experience extreme kind of like trolling and backlash. But you do want to weigh, you know, how important is it that your information gets out? Am I willing to take a little bit of a risk to have, you know, potentially some negative stuff come back at me for that reward of having my information out there and reach people? When we talk about kind of risk, you know, in terms of risk communication, sometimes I feel like the perception of this risk of trolling and backlash doesn't necessarily align with the kind of actual assessment of how often it happens. And I found this really interesting. This is an article by a professor in North Carolina who wrote an op-ed. He's a political scientist, and he made this statement that North Carolina was no longer a fully functioning democracy, kind of based on some of the analysis that he did. And, you know, as you can imagine, this kind of, it went viral. He got a lot of pushback. He ended up going on several TV shows and having, I think he said he got 127 responses to the paper that he wrote, which is like which was way more than he had ever gotten before. And some of them were negative, a lot of them were negative, some of them were positive. But kind of at the end of this article, what he said, kind of what he walked away with, was he said, after sort of the abuse subsided, you know, the negative comments, his experience suggested that the engaged scholarship really moves the conversation forward. At the very least, a new public conversation can begin and doors open in some of the most surprising places. So that even though he did sort of experience some temporary, you know, pain, you might say, or like backlash coming at him, once that was sort of over, it was worth it because this conversation really opened up and he was able to push his work forward, and ultimately it reached a lot of people that it might not have reached. Okay, permanent record. I think people sometimes are worried about this going into the permanent record. It will be there forever. Even if I delete my tweet, it's still out there, you know, banked, and people can access it. Again, this is a little bit of that risk-reward discussion that we're talking about. You could regret it, but I think for the most part, if you keep it professional and sort of stick to the things that you know, it's not that much different from speaking at a conference or, you know, publishing in some ways. So, you know, just be careful with how you use it. Be mindful about when you're using it. And I think that this is can be less of a concern. I think some folks are a little worried about it seeming very self-promotion-y, that they don't want to feel like an influencer. But I think that sharing your work with the world is super important. And again, if you don't kind of put it out there, you're never gonna, it's never gonna reach the audiences that you need to reach. And so, you know, thinking about this, being squirmy about it, I can completely understand, but I think it's really important to kind of push past that a little bit and start small and kind of put yourself out there. And preaching to the choir. So I think this is interesting too, that people feel like, well, I'm not really going to reach my audience because I'm just talking to other scientists out there. And so there was an article in the Facets Journal that did look at this. You know, are scientists on Twitter, are they really just preaching to the choir, or are they, you know, singing from the rooftops? Are they reaching other audiences? And what this found is that scientists, on average, scientist followers are predominantly about 55% other scientists. But once people got beyond a threshold of about 1,000 followers, then it really opened up to include a more diverse audience, including educational organizers, media, members of the public with no state association, and even, you know, sometimes decision makers. And so this varied audience was, you know, in turn followed by more people, and it really resulted in an exponential increase in the social media reach of tweeting academic scientists. So kind of once you reach this threshold, you really can reach a lot more people, and it's exponential growth. And so hopefully this is kind of an encouraging thing to say, like, this isn't just you talking to each other, which in and of itself is a great goal, but you can use it to kind of get outside. Okay. Folks also feel like this is overwhelming. We talked about at the beginning with, you know, kind of that wall of text that I put up about all these different ways that, you know, you can do social media or Twitter. And what I want to say is that there's really almost no wrong way to use Twitter. You can really sort of choose your step of engagement, how you want to kind of like step up or ramp up your engagement or ramp it down, depending on your capacity at the moment. So you start, I'm going to walk you through a few options, kind of like levels. The egg, this is when you start, and it's just like your picture of the egg. So you're just starting out with Twitter. Next is the observer. So, you know, maybe you're just kind of taking it all in and trying to follow a few people and get a sense of what the research is and who the people are to follow and who's interesting. Next is the curator, where you are seeing what's out there and also kind of curating your own, maybe you're retweeting a lot of things, you're sharing others' work and just kind of developing a body of literature that's interesting to you, or the work that you do, or the field that you are particularly in, what your niche is. And people will follow you just to see the content that you sort of curate, right? The generator, when you're actually starting to put kind of your own original thoughts out there or your own research. The conversationalist, so now you're really getting into talking with other people, forming those relationships. And the super user, we've all seen those people out there, lots of followers, lots of engagement, spending lots of time on it. And so you can go kind of like up and down on this ramp, depending on where you are in your career, where you are in your research cycles, you know, and there's no really bad place to be on it. And we say that when it becomes overwhelming, you know, you can step away. You can figure out what that level of involvement is that works for you. We say there is no such thing as information overload, only filter failure. Okay, so finally to wrap up, I am going to talk about how some researchers that we have worked with have used social media and Twitter in particular. And so, you know, what I want to say about this is that sometimes it feels like, Twitter, it's not really like for scientists, it doesn't really work for us. And I want to say that I think this is inspiring because these folks kind of went out and kind of made Twitter what they needed it and wanted it to be. You know, you kind of have to be a little creative sometimes when you're figuring out how to use these platforms and how they can be effective for you. And so how are scientists and researchers using Twitter? There's a few different categories. You know, you can learn, eavesdrop, crowdsource, collect data, share stories, science, discuss and debate, and network. It can be an icebreaker. You can form new collaborations, new connections with your peers, virtually attend conferences, tracking new science, connecting with your peers, like I said. And so this is Tessa Hill. She's a biochemist from UC Davis, and she's someone who you can see has a lot of followers, a good number, almost 10,000. And this was from several years ago, so she has even more. And what she says about it is, I really like using Twitter because I learn about the fascinating science out there. It seems to be one of the best ways to keep on top of the new science coming out, right? And it feels like an opportunity to talk to a big community and also learn what people are talking about. And so another way is to connect with your peers and really engage in that conversation. So going a little bit deeper than just kind of seeing what's out there, right? This is that next step up on that ladder that I talked about. And this is Sarah Meyer. And she's a researcher as well. And she says, you know, getting established, it doesn't mean that lots of people follow you. Rather, it means that you're following the nodes of information in your field, institutions, colleagues, NGOs. The most direct way to get a rapid, diverse census of what's happening in the media and the broader conversation. It's kind of like finding and following the right people for you. Ultimately, it's about growing your network. And we like to talk about networks in terms of nodes, and Twitter is a great place to find people that act as connectors within your community and then across your community. And so if you become an active, trusted source, you know, think about that curator role, you may find yourself acting as a node yourself. You can use it to virtually attend a conference. So this is, for me, this is my favorite way to engage on Twitter. And there's lots of different ways that people are doing conference engagement now. So it's not just limited to Twitter, you know, there's like just thinking about and jumping in and trying out some of these new ways that people are having these conversations at conferences. So you can talk about the hashtags, you know, following the hashtags, seeing what's going on. Okay, and then getting the attention of a policymaker. So social media can be surprisingly effective for this. Like I said, this is the area that I work in with scientists and policymakers. So I have seen kind of this happen, and this study was done. It was a really small study, but I thought it was really interesting because this report found that it takes less than 10 posts about a topic on social media for a congressional office to pay attention to an issue. And the thing is that policymakers are ultimately responsible to their constituents, and so they really want to hear what you have to say. And so I think that that's pretty interesting, that it doesn't actually take that much to grab a policymaker's attention when it's about the right thing, and when you have a message that is resonating with them and is something that they are working on. Hearings are a good example, congressional hearings. So staffers will often be there live tweeting the hearings. You'll see them, you know, if you're looking at this on like C-SPAN or whatever, you'll see the members there and then the staffer is behind them, and they're often like on their phones. Sometimes what they're doing is tweeting. And so if this is a topic that you're interested in, by following this and then like commenting or retweeting these times, like during these times, it's a great way to grab a staff member's attention. So if you have, and anybody else who's following that conversation, right? So if you have science, if you have information that's relevant to what's being discussed, putting it out there, following those hashtags during those hearings is a really interesting way to become part of that conversation. So that's just what I was saying about kind of the 10 posts on social media. Okay, I'm gonna wrap it up. You can also pitch a story to a journalist. Journalists use social media and Twitter quite a lot to find information and to track conversations that they think are interesting. So you can use it to pitch a story. And also level the playing field, which I think is this is kind of a cool thing that I'm gonna leave you with. These Twitter interactions can lead to like these deeper real life interactions. It's informal, and this is Alex Danko. He's a younger, earlier career scientist, and he talks about how the informality of this makes it a lot more real. And so people can get to know each other much more easily, and you can really participate in some of the scientific discourse and relationship building, sort of skipping, I think, some of the hierarchies that we see, especially in academia. So he says, if you're a young student, you can go hang out kind of in these senior scientist mentions on Twitter. And if you're smart and thoughtful, you'll get noticed. Okay, so I'm going to end there. I just want to say that you can go to our website. We have a blog that touches on a lot of these kind of topics and much more. And there's the message box workbook that you can download with a lot more information and examples too. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And if I have time, I'm happy to answer questions.